just getting my little notes ready. Hopefully everyone's doing good today. We're going to talk about archetypes, which is one of my favorite things to talk about. And specifically, we're going to focus in on the moon because we have a big, important lunation coming up, the full moon in Cancer. Of course, I think it's important because I'm a Cancer, but it is important because the moon is in its home when it's a full moon in Cancer. So it becomes very powerful in that sense, and we'll talk about why. So for our card today, I'm going to pull from the Moonology deck because we're talking about the moon. So that's going to be important for us. I will have some resources for you guys after this class today relating to archetypes and my favorite thing to do, which is archetype wheels. We talked about this a little bit last week, but we'll cover it again today. Okay, so our card is the new moon in Capricorn, which I think is funny because we just had one of those. But the theme is your hard work is paying off. So hopefully that resonates for you. Hopefully your hard work is paying off. Capricorn is a hardworking sign. They're known for being very like committed and structured and focused on things. So that makes sense. All right, getting my stuff out of the way. I'm ready to go. So I want to start by talking about archetypes and what an archetype actually is. It's something that I've talked about in other courses kind of sporadically, and I love the concept of it. I use it all the time for business planning and for other things as well. It's kind of the concept behind building rituals to a certain extent. So, um, I think it's super important to understand what it is and just have like a understanding of where the word comes from. So that actually comes from Carl Jung. Opinions on the psyche. So what ended up happening was Carl Jung was much more interested in not just the individual, but the collective and how the collective unconscious kind of bleeds into our everyday life and changes who we are as individuals or kind of at times controls who we act like as individuals. And so um, his work over time came to help us understand symbols and these characters that come from our ancestry that show up in common myths, dreams, and then even religious symbols. And it explained why these things are the same throughout different cultures. So people from completely different backgrounds who, at the time, if you look at ancient history, weren't really talking to each other in any way, were having the same ideas. All religions have like kind of the same themes along with all of the mythology that we have from the Greeks and the Romans, like the same themes, the same types of characters show up. So Jung's work really described why that was, and then this, grew into if you're familiar with like Joseph Campbell and his hero's journey. That's like the concept behind the hero's journey is this idea of us having a collective unconscious with these common characters and themes that show up in different mythologies. So the archetypes then are these universal symbols or characters or patterns of behavior that are found in the collective unconscious across all of these myths and dreams and symbols that we have in our history. So one really good example would be the archetype of the mother. In any culture you look at, we have this idea of what a mother is. And it's kind of universally understood that a mother is a person who takes care of you, that nurtures you, that loves you. They have this, willingness to give up every part of themselves to take care of their children, right? That shows up across the board. And so the mother is a archetype that has an energy that goes along with it that can show up in your life and take over. A big part of many women's life, I shouldn't say all women's life because people choose not to have children, but many women go through this process of embodiment when they become mothers that is just like completely life changing because they have to become a completely different person. And that archetype starts to be embodied whether or not they're ready for it. Um, it comes through energetically, and so they have to figure out what that means for them and go through this process of what we would call individuation, which is where you take the archetype and yourself, your consciousness and your unconsciousness, and you blend them together to become your new, true, authentic self. So that process sometimes happens very easily and sometimes it doesn't. But one thing that does show up in archetypes is that they all have a light and shadow side. So if you want to make this very like black and white, the light side is like the things that society deems as good, and the shadow is the things that society deems are bad. And a lot of times with shadow sides of things, we tend to give them that negative connotation of being bad. So as a person, when we're looking at the shadow side, let's say of being a mother, uh, we tend to take those things and if we see them in ourselves, like shove them down and ignore them, or we like demonize them and other people and create a lot of conflict or chaos around the shadow. Uh, this would be like what we call projection, right? Like pointing out things that you see in other people because you don't like them in yourself. That comes from the shadow being unintegrated. So one of the key concepts um, with Jungian philosophy and archetypes is that we unveil the shadow and integrate it into our being. And that helps us with the process of individuation and becoming our true selves because we're looking at the whole being and accepting the whole being as something that is, it's all good, right? Shadow sides are um, not inherently negative. That's just something that we apply to the shadow itself. So these things, once again, they can be like denied or suppressed in ourselves, and we have to confront them in order to grow. So, um, going back to like the overall theme of an archetype, your archetype is the energy, and it could be a character, it could be a physical thing like a planet or the moon. So all planets, moons, um, and so on have been kind of assigned an archetype through mythology. So that's how we understand these archetypes, or through astrology, as an example, which also still comes from mythology. So we have these characters that we assign to the planets, and we use those characters, those archetypes, to embody and describe, who we are as a Capricorn or a Cancer, or um, what kind of energy might be showing up during that season. Sorry, I'm just letting people in from the waiting room, and then that distracted my train of thought. Anyways, so the archetypes become embodied in that way, and we use them for performing rituals and things like that because we want to bring in the energy that's showing up with that specific archetype. So, one thing that I think is really important to go back to is that archetypes exist in the unconscious mind and they are collective. So you can pretty easily like look at yourself, for example, and kind of give yourself a list of archetypes that you know that you embody on a regular basis. And the concept of, finding archetypes and utilizing them then comes to what kind of energy do I want to bring into my life and embody, and how can I do that? So you choose those archetypes based on that concept. Uh, any questions so far? I think the system is not meeting people when they come into the room. So sorry if we hear little noises. I'm catching them as they come in. Okay, so like I was saying, there's pretty common archetypes throughout history and throughout things like movies. For example, the villain is an archetype, the mother, uh, the father is another one. Tarot is full of archetypes, the major arcana, all archetypes. The symbolism that comes through in the like imagery of the tarot, all archetypes. So we can use any of that to influence the things that we do on a daily basis by intentionally pulling from that energy and intentionally embodying. So, embodiment is this idea of consciously integrating an archetype into your behavior. And what it requires is that you see that archetype as like a living energy, and then you kind of plan out how you're going to let it shape how you think, feel, and act. And I think it's really important sometimes to write down what you think that means. So taking, if you want to take the moon for an example, which we'll do today, um, how can you plan to embody based on the energy that is most potent during that time, or most potent when that archetype shows up? So the process of embodiment includes awareness, so figuring out what archetype you want to use, and then what what comes up, what resonates with that archetype, what are the normal patterns that appear with that archetype. And then we go through some reflection, so looking at like the qualities of the lessons and the shadows and the light aspects that we want to embrace. And then also with the shadow aspect, it's looking at what can we be prepared for, flexing your awareness muscles and finding out what is potentially going to come up, and can you deal with that, and is it going to cause you to have some sort of like negative emotional reaction if you notice that coming up during that time. And then we go through integration. So integration is actively trying to change things in your everyday life, or in the case of what we're going to talk about today, like how do you take the archetype of a moon and incorporate it in a ritual, a treatment, a facial, a massage, whatever you want to integrate that into. So what are the qualities and things that can be integrated? Are there behavioral changes that you can make in your everyday life? Are there changes in your treatment that you can make based on, the steps that you normally flow through? So can you change your protocol to match the energy of that time or that archetype that you're trying to embody? You change the tools that you're using, things like that. Are there different colors or symbols or um, sound healing tools, whatever that allow for that integration because they're supporting that energy. Then we look at the shadow once again. I brought this up with the reflection and awareness, but really mapping out what is the shadow of this archetype, and can you face these darker aspects? What are you going to be looking for? What feelings can you kind of run through for yourself in that shadow aspect? And then we work through expression. So, you know, what do you want this expression to look like? How does this come through? If you're looking at archetypes for yourself in your relationships, in your personal life, if you're looking at it for business, how does this archetype actually help you to express what you want to put across? A lot of times in the past, when I've talked about archetypes with classes, it's about archetype embodiment for business. So taking, what you want to accomplish this quarter, finding the archetypes that are going to support that, and then really mapping out like where does that archetype show up for you? Is this the archetype that you embody when you respond to an email? Is this the archetype that you're embodying when you're creating content? And what does that look like? What is that voice? What is that archetype like to wear? What is their favorite color? What kind of music do they listen to? Like we're really getting into the full expression of the archetype. And when we think about it in terms of treatments, what music goes well during this season or with this archetype? How does this impact our relationship with our client? What's going to come up during this time based on the archetypal expression in the universe right now? And then, the last step of embodiment is the integration, which like over time it becomes a part of you and works in harmony with these other aspects of your life. And in treatments, what I find is there are things that I really love about each lunation or each season that I like to bring into treatments all the time, or I do them because um, when I put together solar return rituals, for example, I use the archetype of the season to really iron out what that treatment looks like. And then sometimes I bring in things that I haven't used in a long time, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to be doing this more often. Because now it's a part of the treatment and it makes sense and it's harmonizing and contributing to my treatments in a different way. So that is wholeness, right? We're creating a whole feeling, uh, a whole vibe out of your treatments by embodying these archetypes and bringing them in regularly. So, that being said, I want to focus in on the moon and kind of go through what the themes are of the moon as an archetype, what energy comes up, um, what you're likely to experience during full moons versus new moons, and how we can use this in the treatment room to create um, treatments that are maybe focused on lunations. I like to do special treatments. So, doing something that's maybe like a full moon treatment or a new moon treatment might be really fun. Or if you're doing more seasonally themed treatments, so like I was saying, I do solar returns, and those are focused on astrology. You do it during your birthday season. So, if you're a Cancer, then this is a great uh, way to incorporate those, or if you want to like do a special Cancer season facial. Now, I'm a Cancer, so I feel like a lot of the times, this concept of the moon really shows up in my treatments naturally, just comes through me as an archetype that is uh, integrated into me quite well. So let's talk about the moon and what it's all about. The moon is a So the moon is a great symbol of cycles and intuition and mystery, and it's really a feminine symbol. So I say that because you can think about even like having like a monthly cycle. A lot of times it's referred to as a moon cycle or your moon, right? So it's this idea of like constantly changing and going through this cyclical experience and going through the light and shadow over and over again, the seen, the unseen, regularly. So it has this cyclical feeling to it, regardless of how you like apply it. So um, it really focuses in on like time, change, rhythm, beginning, going through something, ending something, releasing, renewal, begin again, experience and grow, bring to fruition, release, renewal. We're constantly doing that along with moon cycles. So that then, like I said, really dives into the feminine energy of nurturing and receptivity and emotional growth that comes along with going through cycles. So you have to have that like receptivity to what you're experiencing and emotional depth to integration. It can't just be um, masculine energy and doing all the time. There has to be that like culmination, release, and come back into doing again. And that's really where the feminine energy comes through. So the moon also is a symbol of our intuition and guides us through our like inherent knowing. So it kind of guides us into exploring what lies beneath the surface or what our dreams, our instincts are showing us, what emotional truths um, show up. And I say emotional truths because the moon is a very emotional object. So it acts like a reflector. So you think about how we see the moon, it's because it reflects the sunlight. It also reflects back to us our emotions. and kind of forces us to process and reflect on emotional experiences. Um, and a lot of times the moon controls kind of how we feel or the flow or the intensity of how we feel. Um, if you are a Cancer, you are known for being emotional, overly emotional, because the moon rules Cancer. And a lot of times um, that can be seen as a shadow aspect of being like overwhelmed and just kind of like overflowing with emotion. And so a lot of us, Cancers, myself speaking from the eye, tend to deny that aspect and shove it down because we see it as a negative or shadow aspect. And so that's one thing about the moon that comes up on the shadow side is hiding emotions or refusing to deal with emotions because they're just so like overwhelming or we just don't want to deal with it. So when we look at like integrating shadow and light in the moon, in terms of the moon, it's really about accepting all of our emotions as valid and allowing all of those emotions to come through when they need to come through. But during times like the full moon, that can become really overwhelming. And so we have to be aware of that possibly happening and either prepare ourselves for it or um, yeah, I was gonna say try to have some control over it, but that's like a very anti-emotional thing to say. Like just be prepared for it, right? Allow it to take place. So the moon is also very connected to water. It the moon sign Cancer is a water sign, but water also comes up when we think about how the moon affects the earth. So the tides are really uh, controlled by the moon, and the moon then becomes like representative of some things that come up with water as an archetype. So the concept of like adaptability and flow and depth, right? In archetypal language, water is really about depth, emotional depth, feelings, intuition. And the moon then comes together with that um, in its like integration with water, connection to water. So, the key themes with the moon that we want to think about are intuition, cycles, emotion, instinct, safety, nurturing. And if you just take those words and kind of think about how could I build a treatment around this that also maybe includes some water elements, it makes it a little bit easier, like plan out where you're going to go with it. So some ways that we can actually like engage with this archetype might be tracking lunar phases and making sure that you're aligning your intentions and rituals with them. So changing up your treatments during the lunation cycles to match what's going on. Maybe exploring dreams or subconscious themes. So asking if you're going to do this in a treatment, I would maybe have start them with a prompt of looking into some of their some subconscious themes that are coming up. Um, Maybe asking about recent dreams, not that they need to tell me, but having them think about that. And then the other way is once again pulling a card. So pulling a card is so easy because you can have people just kind of meditate on what that card means to them. Um, and I like to change up cards for the season. So if you're looking at a a moon focused like lunar cycle type treatment, you could do something that is a little bit more like gentle, nurturing, emotional, like a lighthearted deck or a oh God, I can't remember that lady's name, Rebecca something. I have some of her decks and they're very like kind of like fairy vibes, nice and light, and there's like watery images, very Cancer vibes. That's what I would normally use for someone during that type of like emotional lunation. Whereas if we're in the case of trying to release things, maybe pulling a deck that has some themes around release, or if I just want them to work through like a new moon cycle, so we're bringing up new things, giving them maybe like an archetype deck or something that they can pull to uh, to have something new to focus on. So choose your ways of getting them to like explore their subconscious themes in a way that makes sense for you. Like I said, I don't need them to like tell me what they're feeling or what they're dreaming about or whatever. It's really more something that they can reflect upon while they're receiving the treatment. And then we work with water. So I'll look it up for you. I can't remember, although someone might know. She has like multiple different decks that are, it's like Rebecca something, I think. I can't remember the name, but I'll find it for you before we leave today. Thank you, Elena. Uh, okay, so the next practice of integrating the moon then in a treatment would be working with water. So you can do that with sound healing tools like shell chimes, uh, wave drums. I was trying to think of the name, the ocean drum, wave drum. Um, you can do it with moon themed tools or moon. So essentially, what they do is they take the frequency of the moon measured by Hans Cousteau and they match the like tuning fork or instrument to that frequency. So you can use those types of instruments. Um, and that's a really great way to integrate water along with like having water sounds. It doesn't have to be a sound healing tool necessarily, but it could be like water sounds in the background, ocean sounds, if you will. And then movement. So, uh, if you have done embodied touch, um, either like on Zoom with me or in person, we do this as a group where we work through each element, water, earth, fire, air, and we talk about what that feels like as a movement. So when you're massaging, working with people, what does water feel like? Water feels like flowing. It's it can be gentle, but it can also be more aggressive if you just think about like what a wave feels like crashing over you, or what it feels like to like float in a river, float in the water, in a pool even, what it feels like to have rain dripping over you. That is what water feels like when you move your hands. So there's a lot of like fluidness to it, almost like a dancey feeling. And when you're doing a treatment focused on the moon as an archetype, that is how your treatment should feel. So, how can you move your hands or your body to really embody water? That's something to think about. And then with moon cycles, we also get to think about, do we want cleansing rituals? And so, um, like during a full moon or whatever, when you're trying to release, cleansing is a really good idea to get rid of things that we want to let go of. So can you integrate maybe a longer cleanse that's a little bit more thorough, or using different tools during the cleanse to make it a little bit longer. Whereas when it's a new moon and we're like building up for something, um, you may work a little bit more uh, I was not aggressively. Aggressively isn't really the word for it, but it's really about like bringing something new in, right? So how can you how can you integrate that into the treatment? The other way to work with water in a treatment in this way is to create moon water. So you just put water out during the full or the new moon, and you let the energy of the moon influence the water, and then you can use that water in your treatment. So those are some different ideas of what you could do. And like I was kind of saying, this is going to change based on whether it's a full moon or a new moon. So we actually have a Cancer full moon coming up, like I was saying, and this is a really powerful lunation because the moon is in its sign. It's in its home sign, which it really loves. And so this is going to really amplify what what the moon gives us and what Cancer stands for. Like think about it like a double power up. Uh, when you make moon water, I don't really worry about the container, but normally it is glass. So that will allow like more of the moon light to come through. Although when you're doing new moon water, there's no light to come through, so it doesn't really matter. But it's really more about like being outside and taking in that energy. You can put your crystals out there too. Okay, So full moon in Cancer is coming up. I want to talk about how these themes work together and then what that's going to look like in our treatments and in our treatment room. So the full moon in Cancer is, like I was saying, really emotionally powerful because it amplifies both the moon and the cancerness, the full moon and the cancerness of it. Um, the full moon is going to be focused on release, letting go of things. Um, but Cancer is the sign of our home and family, intuition, and emotion. So it really amplifies the emotional reflection around home, family, intuition, and like I said, amplifies emotion, our emotional security, how we feel. So this can really make people um, very sensitive. And this could be in any way, right? Like it could be experiencing extreme joy or grief or like any emotion just becomes very amplified and for people who are not very in touch with their emotions, this gives them a good time energetically to go in a little bit deeper and explore what those emotions really are and why they're coming up. But the other thing that Cancer really loves is self-care. So this is a great time to receive treatments because the moon guides us into this like slowness and rest through the full moon cycle of release. So we're releasing, we're letting go, we're slowing down, we're just like cuddling up with warm blankets and warm scents and things that make us feel really, really good. So people are going to want to be nurtured. They're going to want like the more that if you were putting together, for example, a treatment for the full moon in Cancer, I would make it a long treatment. Like I would not do a 60-minute treatment because there's no time to slow down and get rest in that time frame. Like you need an hour and a half to 2 hours. So it's really about like giving them that option or whatever to nurture themselves in a more gentle, long way, slow way. The other themes that are going to come up during the Cancer full moon will be home and family. So maybe some themes around like building more security at home or strengthening the bonds at home, so spending more time with family. Or sometimes it's like healing wounds that are showing up in the home. And so this is just so that you think about what people are coming in experiencing. They may be feeling really sensitive around these types of things. Um, and full moons really focus on release. And so some of this can come up because it needs to be let go, letting go of like hurt, limiting beliefs, difficult family patterns. All of this it is going to come up during this time potentially and and will then allow people to heal better. And so uh, one thing that can really help us with this in a treatment is just creating space for people to feel really safe and allowing them to experience whatever emotions do come up. A lot of times, if you're not like used to nurturing and self-care, then laying down and getting a treatment can be really discomforting. And so you'll end up getting a little emotional because you're like you don't even know how to relax, and then when you do relax it brings up all of these feelings. So just allow people to release if they need to release. Giving them the option to like be okay in that space is really important. And strengthening the heart chakra. So if you use any tools that relate to the heart chakra, this is going to be very important during this time to just make people feel really safe and loved so that they can release if they need to release. Um, and then the last thing that really comes up during a Cancer full moon is our intuition and psychic awareness. So if you already think that you're psychic, like this is going to make everything more amplified. And so it's really important to trust your instincts, your gut reactions during this time because your gut is telling you something. Um, Trust the things that you feel, right? And That doesn't mean like take swift action with things that you feel, but really trust that your body is trying to tell you something or that what you know to be true is actually true. Because a lot of times we question ourselves with that kind of stuff. Like, uh, if you experience like feelings of intuition and you're just like, that is crazy. Why would I think this thing? I have no proof of it. If that's the kind of person you are, now's the time to really focus on like your trust with yourself and following through that you're feeling. So the challenges that are going to come up for us during this time are that this is really overwhelming and it can be exhausting. So you may feel more tired, but your clients may feel more tired too, which is, kind of good for us because we want to make them feel relaxed and like pet them and things like that while they're laying down and experiencing all of this. But it can make you a little bit moody as well. So people can be a little bit more triggered with defensive reactions and maybe a little bit more withdrawn. But the other thing about Cancer is that Cancer is very nostalgic and like a little bit obsessed with the past. So while this is like a time of letting go of emotions, Cancer is trying to hold on to that. So sometimes it just makes the like letting go a little difficult. And I think where that comes up for us sometimes is like thinking about things that we've done in the past and wanting to keep doing those things because that's what we've always done versus maybe making some changes, especially going into a new year, right? So like some of you guys did set New Year's goals or have new things that you're working on in your life. And a lot of times clinging to the past and the way that you've always done things can inhibit you from moving forward in those new things that you're trying to do. So maybe just being a little bit aware of like whether that's coming up for you in your business or your life, because that like overly obsessive kind of nostalgia for how things used to be can be really powerful during this time just because of the lunation and the full moon. So, um, really the big picture of like this archetype of the full moon is that it's going to be very emotional. That's going to be coming through our collective unconscious. It's going to also, because the full moon archetype is always about release, it's going to come up with like this letting go of things. So we just have to remember to allow that to happen. And in a treatment, if you are bringing people in more of a ritualistic sense, how do you get them to release throughout that ritual? So, can you start them with something that prompts them to think about what they want to release? Use things like sage or whatever you want to use, or maybe like some more of a cleansing treatment, a release treatment to really bring in the energy of that, embody that energy. And then because this is all very heart centered, bringing in some heart chakra supportive tools can be really important to allow for that vulnerability and nurturing to take place. So, I mentioned that there were some like steps to embodying. So, I want to go through that for the full moon, and that will kind of close us out for the day. Uh, the full moon archetype embodiment can look like a big emotional release moment. So if we're trying to bring in awareness of this, then you need to be aware that this is that type of time. Like it's going to be incredibly intense potentially, but it also should be like a culmination with clarity. So we have this emotional intensity, but then we realize something and we can allow that to go away because it's the end of a cycle. So that's the thing to be aware of. We're ending something. We can let it go now. We want to reflect on what exactly we're trying to complete and release. So if you're trying to plan for this and embody this archetype intentionally, what can you let go of? What do you need to let go of? What are the happy and sad truths of what needs to go away, right? And just be aware that as you reflect it can be a little bit overwhelming. So maybe if you are feeling very like emotional and resistant, just accepting that that's normal instead of trying to fight it. With integration, we are looking at embracing the energy by identifying those areas that are ready to be released and transformed. So, do we have limiting beliefs, for example, that need to go away, unhealthy relationships, habits that we need to let go of, and then clear that space for new growth, which is going to come in the next cycle? Um, for shadow, what we want to look for is are we avoiding difficult emotions? So sometimes what ends up happening is like we know that this in influential time is coming up, this very emotional Cancer full moon. So we're just like not going to deal with it. This, all these things I'm saying about like going into how you feel and whatnot, you're just like not into it. So you avoid it. And you know what? If that's what your nervous system needs, that's totally okay. But be aware of it and acknowledge that that's what's happening because sometimes just acknowledging that can help take away from like the overreaction or like overwhelming feeling that we have to avoid versus dealing with something. Um, and then as we work through expression, we're really focusing on um, literal expression of emotion. So letting things come through, letting your intuition guide your decisions because your intuition is going to be based on your feelings, and your feelings are usually correct. Um, and really understanding that, like, by allowing the full moon energy to come through, by allowing the emotion to come through, and allowing the release to happen, we are aligning ourselves with growth. So that is closing out a cycle that then allows for new space for a new cycle to take place. Um, and that kind of transformation needs to happen. So that is pretty opposite of what we would do for a new moon because a new moon is all about starting new cycles versus releasing. During a new moon, it's really like introspective and kind of quiet and just seeing what we want for the future and really reflecting on like what a fresh start would look like, mapping out what that might look like for us, what we want to manifest. The new moons are more about the manifestation cycles versus the full moon that we're about to go through is going to be about release and letting go. Um, New moon energy is also about setting goals. And so being really like clear and purposeful with visualization, that's going to help us with integration. So while integration for a full moon is like, how can I map out like what to let go and what to not to hold on to anymore? A new moon is going to be, okay, what am I bringing in now? What do I really want to focus on? Whether that's like in our personal life or professional life. So this is about being really intentional with things. Uh, the shadow of a new moon is all about impatience, fear of the unknown, and kind of fighting the urge to be premature with your actions. So impatience and like wanting to get things done so fast sometimes leads to um, not doing a very good job at things. And fear of the unknown prevents us from actually starting. So when we go into a new moon cycle, we really want to think about do we have some of those patterns of like impatience and fear that show up? And how can we overcome that as we work through the shadow side? And then the expression of a new moon is really about hope and trust and clarity. So we're like understanding what needs to happen. We're trusting that that's going to be a good thing. And we are hoping that it's all going to work out, but we're also hoping for a better future. So it allows us to then be like really intentional and move forward very mindfully with things if we align our rhythms with these cycles. So during a new moon is when you should be doing your planning. When you're in a full moon is that's when you should be doing your cleansing and releasing. And you can do that cyclically every month, regardless of what the lunation is. Um, we obviously talked about the moon today, but every time there's a new or a full moon, there's a new archetype that's also kind of meshing in with the new and full moon energy and amplifying uh, the themes that show up. So the next new moon should be Aquarius, and that's going to have much different themes than our last new moon of Capricorn. So as a treatment focus, you could do this monthly where you have, a couple days before the new and the new moon and after the new moon, and then a couple days before and after the full moon, where your rituals are focused on that energy and use different tools and different um, products, different steps to really bring about the energy or the archetype of that specific season. Uh, but yeah, I like using the full and new moon concept because it is cyclical and it comes up every month twice. So you always have like a new and a full moon every month. Sometimes you have more than one in each month, but it gives you this like dance or flow of things and how they can work in a treatment room. Or even like for those of you that do other things like sound healing, it's really common to do like full moon in Cancer sound bath or whatever to really amplify the themes that are taking place there. So I think that it's definitely something to think about if you're thinking about like incorporating more like spiritual kind of cyclical elements in your treatment room. But it's also something to be aware of personally for like what your clients are going to come in experiencing and dealing with and kind of like um, emotionally vomiting onto you sometimes. And then what you're personally going to be dealing with that creates the background of how you're seeing what other people are coming in with, right? So like you're focusing or projecting that shadow onto them sometimes based on whatever the lunation is. So it provides us with some internal awareness to keep track of the moon cycles and maybe do a little bit of research on the archetypes for each season. If this is something that you believe in or feel called to or um, like to focus on. So uh, hopefully that's helpful. Like for me, I do really like archetypes. I don't normally do a lot of like new full moon type stuff just because uh it's a little bit harder for me to plan for that. But what I use it for is like noticing what comes up in the treatment room and maybe changing up little things. So during a full moon in Cancer, for example, I know my treatments are already going to come across more flowy and slow and more nourishing because I am very connected to the moon as Cancer. And so that energy is going to come through me a little bit easier. And I'm going to be working more in that like flowy, watery way than probably I normally would. And so that's kind of how I use it. You can also change very simple things, like I was saying, what cards you pull for clients if you pull a card every time. You can change up what crystals you use if you use crystals every time. You can change up your sound healing tools. This is the other way I use this actually, is I will use like the full or the new moon fork based on whatever lunation is happening at that point in time. So if someone comes in and they have a treatment on or around that full moon in Cancer, we're going to be using the full moon fork on them, not the new moon fork, right? Because that doesn't make sense during a full moon to use a new moon tool. Um, and so that's more of how I use it is like in those very little simple things that can be changed versus doing whole treatments focused on it. But I know people that do, full and new moon treatments and they're very successful with that. They love doing it and making it an entire ritual. And so that's something that could be done. And I encourage you to do whatever you're aligned to. Um, for me, I like doing it seasonally with the astrology signs and not so much every lunation. It's just a little much. But some people love that idea of just like having all of these different fun things that they can do. And I totally respect that, obviously. That's what we're talking about today.